It is Friday, February 28th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Wilds episode of LTPS. Shout out to anybody playing that game today or for the foreseeable future, because that is a big game that came out recently. Now, I'm not much of a Monster Hunter fan, but I'm happy for you if you're going to be getting a lot of game time in coming up very soon. I was more excited for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Early Days collection, which came out yesterday, so that's kind of where I sit on that whole thing. Having said that, we do have some PlayStation stories to go over as always, so let's begin with our final warning for the February PS Plus Essential lineup, so make sure you claim those games. This coming Tuesday on the 4th, it's going to change over to Dragon Age the Veilguard on PS5, and then TMNT, the Cowabunga Collection PS4, PS5, and Sonic Colors Ultimate PS4 as well. Now, undeniably, the big standout title here is going to be Dragon Age the Veilguard. The game came out 4 months ago, basically. A very big, high-profile new entry in the Dragon Age franchise. And it's been very contentious the entire way through of the art direction, the gameplay loop, and just the sort of identity for the franchise, and now underperforming what EA and the director said about the game. And so there's so much going on with that, and it's a pretty shocking thing to see this game go into Plus, the lowest tier of Plus, within 4 months, right? It's kind of insane. And there's two angles here, right? Where it's like, if you did pre-order the game, pay full price, it never feels good when it goes into subscription that quickly. At the same time, though, you've got a swath of other people that have, like, not paid for the game, not wanted to buy it. Maybe they were nervous or didn't, like, care for the reviews. And so it's just, there's so many other folks that now will have access to the game. So it's, generally speaking, a pretty big win for most people that can now, jump into the game and not have to have that financial commitment with it. And who knows, you might end up really liking it, right? That's always the beauty of subscription, is, experiencing things that you otherwise thought you would not have enjoyed. So it's, for the most part, kind of a big deal, a bigger win for most other folks. But yeah, it's insane. The thing is, too, like, yeah, the game underperformed, and that it's a pretty big tell when it goes into subscription. But it's still, I can't imagine this was a cheap deal for Sony relative to, say, other deals they do. So this was probably a pretty expensive one, and one that EA had to also make to see a bigger return out of this entry in the franchise. Either way, you've also got TMNT, those are really fun games, a great collection of games. It's got Rewind in there too, so it's a lot easier to get through some of those games, and it's not as punishing, you know what I mean? And then Sonic, of course, is always Sonic. That kind of speaks for itself. So, yeah, I would say this was a solid lineup that we have coming up going into March. Now, in other PS Plus news, we should also mention that Blueprints, which was confirmed to be a day one launch on PS Plus Extra at some point this coming spring, well, now we know that game's coming out April 10th. So that's the puzzle architectural game that looks really interesting, actually. But now we know the game is going to launch April 10th. And oftentimes with these day one PS Plus launches, if they're not going to line up directly on the day that the lineup should go live, it will just launch right then and there into PS Plus Extra outside of the normal window. So just bear in mind that that game is coming out April 10th, and we now know that that's when you can access the game via Extra. Now, getting into some game news here, starting off with Midnight Murder Club, which kind of came out of nowhere. Well, it's been known, but Sony's the one that jumped on this game to publish it on PS5 and PC, and that kind of felt out of nowhere. But we now know the game's coming out in early access on those two platforms on March 13th. Which it will cost $19.99 USD for one copy of the game, because that is the cool little beneficial thing they're doing here. It's very similar to Hazelight, where one person can buy the game and they can give out 5 additional passes for being able to play the game with your friends, right? Because the game is up to 6 players in that dark mansion, because that's the gameplay hook, is that you're in this dark mansion. You can't see the other players, but you can hear them. If somebody fires a gun, then they can briefly give away their position, or if they set something on fire. So it does look kind of goofy and fun. It's meant to be a 6-player party game, and so the idea is one person buys it, then pretty much a whole crew can jump in for $20, right? So not a bad deal. I will say that's still going to be really tough, I think, for this game to find a big audience. Not sure if it really needs it. It seems like it is a little bit more modest in budget, but it's just really tough nowadays with games or multiplayer in general. So anytime you charge money, it's just, that's the barrier that's going to put a lot of people off. And then for PC, PSN is still required. So I think the game still has an uphill battle, but it is something where Sony seemingly decided to publish it on PS5 and PC, and it's going into early access too, which is not something Sony does often, or that they can, the kind of stuff that they can get behind. They're being a bit more lax in that department, which makes sense given their understanding of the live service market nowadays. So we'll see how this game develops over time, but yeah, that game is going to launch in early access very soon. Next up, we have some Marvel Spider-Man 3 news. That's right, we actually do have something to say about this game. It's not, in my view, surprising, but I think some definitely need to hear this after playing the second game. So with that in mind, we are getting into slight spoiler territory. I'm not really going to spoil anything, obviously, but if you played the game, you have the context of what this means. So with that in mind, approach the story cautiously, but the point is, Yuri Lowenthal, the actor for Peter Parker in the Insomniac Spider-Man games, he was recently speaking with the Direct at Multicon this past weekend, and when he was asked about his role in the next game, Yuri said, and I quote here, "There are very few things that I can say about this game, but you have somehow landed on the one thing that I can answer, and that's yes, Peter is not gone. He will be a part of the next game, and he won't be relegated to the couch, I promise." So again, if you played the second game, then you kind of know what he's addressing there. What I will say, and here's a spoiler timestamp to jump ahead if you don't want to hear this, I'll still try and keep this spoiler free, but the implication to me finishing the second game was they're setting up so many different things that have to be tied up in that final arc in what is a culmination of multiple heroes and villains all clashing and how they interact with each other and how that story plays out. That's where there's a lot of unknowns, obviously, but it's not as though the second game read to me as, oh, now it's all Miles, and maybe Peter has to only jump in towards the final quarter of the game or something like that, right? I don't know. To me, it reads as multiple different heroes that will have their own arcs and their own things that are wrapped up, all these loose ends that are going to get tied up, like the one or two side quests that played out throughout 2, and you don't get to figure out what really happens with that because clearly it's going into the third game. So to me, the third game really is going to be a lot of stuff all playing out next to each other, and in a way it's going to be a final epic, a huge send-off for these characters, and to act as though Peter won't play a major role in that, I found to be kind of surprising from the community, expecting that, or reading the second game's ending as like, oh, now it's just full-blown Miles, which I don't know, that's just not really how I felt the ending was, the message they were trying to send. But with that in mind, we now have Yuri pretty much saying like, don't worry, he's going to be in the game, and I'm sure he will play a bigger role than some would expect. Moving on to our next news story, Sony recently put out a new creator-to-creator video on their YouTube channel, which they don't really do these too often, but this one was really cool because you had Sucker Punch's co-founder and studio head, Brian Fleming, speaking with Nicholas Doucet, Team Asobi's studio director and game director. So they were talking back and forth about their experiences working on games, and also congratulating Nick on the recent Game of the Year awards that Astrobot has been picking up. And Brian also touched on something that was, like, we just learned about this from the Colin and Shuhei Yoshida interview, which was Brian approaching Sony, showing off the Prophecy and asking to cancel that game. So it's so crazy that we just had that info come out, and then Brian indirectly talks about that during this conversation. He doesn't name the Prophecy, but the way he's talking about this, like, it's that game. They wanted to cancel it because they couldn't really figure out why people should care about the game that they're making. So that was that just lined up perfectly. But Brian also talked about how they approach their own games, and talking about how they iterate on that work. So we do have one quote here where he says, "We talk about this at work as a staircase, and that each game is really building off the work we did from the previous games. And we want to continue to really push creatively and technically as storytellers and as artists." We are probably very close, or maybe not very close, but close-ish to seeing more of this game if they plan on showing it off during either the late May State of Play, if they plan on doing another one of those, but either that or going into June, Summer Game Fest. Whatever the case is, we will probably see a lot more of it. And I am curious to see how they will capitalize on what they built and established from Tsushima. Sucker Punch, as Brian said, I mean, they're very good at building upon prior entries. So, and that goes with not just, Sly Cooper, but also Infamous, because there's so much company turnover too. So it's not like everybody that made Sly is still there. But it's just a sort of core principle the studio has maintained throughout its history. And we saw some glimpses in Yote with like firearms, for example. But I am not just gameplay too. I mean, I really want to see where the story goes for what is another Ghost story of, you know, this person that's going against the grain of society and what people expect of her. So like, that's the one thing I always take away from Tsushima, is that like I love the gameplay, but I also that story sticks with you. It hits pretty hard. And so I think we'll see a lot more of that. I'm hoping. So Yote is up there for me as far as games I'm excited for, and it's good knowing that the game's going to launch this year, and we'll probably see it fairly soon. Moving on to a new rumor for the God of War Remasters, which we've been hearing about for a little bit now at this point, and now we've got the most credible sort of entry in this series of rumors. So this comes from Giant Bomb's Jeff Grubb, where recently he wrote this in during a Game Mess Decides episode, simply saying that the remasters are real and they're going to be revealed soon. What most people probably saw was this repost on Blue Sky where Jeff said he thinks that the God of War Remaster rumors jumped the gun a little bit, and they'll probably happen closer to the 20th anniversary for the series, which is next month. And yeah, so a few things going on here. Number one, anniversaries. This is always so funny, right? Because anniversaries come up all the time for big game IP, and you've got the fandom that is hyper fixated on that upcoming date, praying for a remaster, port, new entry, whatever the context is for that series of games. And almost always it comes and goes, nothing happens. Maybe the publisher puts out a celebratory tweet, maybe new merchandise. I mean, something's better than nothing, I would argue. But like, it's so funny how this always plays out the same way every single time, which, like, is that really a shock? Logistically, it's, you know, anniversaries are a very arbitrary date, so whether it's a new entry, which would take a very long time, or even port or remaster jobs, that's still just logistically hard to line up with what is an arbitrary sort of deadline, right? So that's why things often just don't happen. Or if we don't have rumors building up to an anniversary, like, chances are ain't nothing happening. But it is always cool when sometimes it does happen. So in this case, it seems like, yeah, we actually are going to get something, which is kind of insane because the rumors, before, the sources were just very dubious. I wasn't fully convinced this was happening, right? I think the bare minimum probably would be the new emulators on PS4, PS5. So, you know, we've got PSP, now PS2, so you could see the games playable on PS4, PS5 that way. But the one caveat I always add is, well, if they do something extra for these games, it would be these games. God of War is huge. They would absolutely want these games on PC to put them next to the 2018 release in Ragnarok. So if we're talking 1, 2, and 3, that would make sense. Not sure about the PSP or the PSP entries, I should say, and also Ascension. But at least 1 through 3, it seems like that's what's happening. But that's where there's still so much mystery surrounding what these look like. Like, what are they really doing with these games? Because 3, you would think, okay, resolution, frame rate bump, native PS5 version. I'm not sure they'd really do that much extra as far as like bringing up the graphical fidelity for that game. But 1 and 2, it's like, okay, these are PS2 games. We've not seen Sony repackage and sell PS2 games in quite a while. So it's like, are they just going to look like straight up PS2 games? So it's like, well, at that point, why not emulate them and put them on put them through the premium classic program? Or will it be something very similar to, let's say, Crisis Core, where it's really blurring the lines between a remaster and a remake, which would maybe be a very good compromise as far as making them look very nice, but not having this insane budget where you're bringing them up to 2018 standards of visual fidelity, right? I think that's kind of unrealistic. That is a full-blown remake. But like, that's the question mark. I'm so curious as to what it looks like, how they're going to be packaged. You would assume PC and PS5, but I don't know. So it seems like we don't have to wait too long to have this thing get an official reveal. So yeah, I'm very curious to see what this does look like. Moving on to the India Hero Project, where we just got 2 game announcements coming out of the program at some point. No confirmed dates or anything, but we do know 2 games just got announced. One of them is called Bloody Boots. Now, there's no gameplay, but we do know it's coming to PS5 and PC. It's being described as a third-person action-adventure game set in Cranktown, which is a dystopian entertainment hub that thrives on illegal gambling, and you play as a fugitive teen trapped in the town with mutants, mech-enhanced supervillains, and bosses. The other game is Loco, and we do have a trailer for this. It's a cross-platform 3D platformer that lets you share custom characters, enemies, and levels using an in-game editor. And that's coming to PS5, PC, and iOS. So very much they're going for the Fortnite, Roblox type of experience, which is super cool. Me, I always think of like, oh, LBP, right? Play, create, share. But yeah, you can see what they're going for. So great to have two more announcements kind of out of nowhere because it's a little bit late. Well, it's on the East Coast here, so one of the later announcements for SIE over in California, but it was cool to get that announcement just very recently. And now we're still waiting for some announcements from the Middle East North Africa Hero Project as well, which that was announced back in mid-2024, like August around there, if I remember correctly. So it shouldn't be too much longer to see what games are in that program, so we should have even more announcements too. All right, moving on to some major hardware news. It finally happened. It seems like I was a little bit late on this prediction-wise because I thought this would happen last year, but it's happening this year, which is starting tomorrow. PSVR2 is getting an official MSRP price cut. So by tomorrow, you can get PSVR2 for $399 USD or €449, 399 pounds sterling, or 66,980 yen, and that's for the base headset and also the Call of the Mountain bundle as well, which it seems like they're still running through this initial allocation, this initial batch that they made, because I'm still not entirely sure. I could be wrong if they even made more units past the initial window when they launched the thing back in 2023, because PSVR 2 is 2 years old now at this point. But yeah, it's a big deal. I mean, it's obviously late. Now, the thing is, one would argue too late. And I would say, like, PSVR 2 has a VR problem. It's not a PSVR 2 problem. I know this is something that gets talked about left and right, where it's so easy to complain about PSVR 2 as far as price, PC compatibility, no backwards compatibility, the software lineup. We could fix all these things, and the headset is still going to have a problem moving millions and millions of units. It's a VR problem. The marketplace is simply not growing the way a lot of big companies thought it would at this point in time. Having said that, I think this is still great because there is a world where PSVR 2 can sort of thrive in this sort of niche marketplace, and that it's an affordable headset relative to other high-end headsets. It has the PC compatibility, and it also creates this very sustainable environment for VR developers, which is when they sell games on PSVR 2, they can make money and then be able to make another game for PSVR 2. Very similar to PS Vita, a lifetime install base that did not set the world on fire, but you had this, very healthy relationship of Vita owners were getting games and developers were making those games and making money on Vita. So that's where I fall on PSVR 2. It's very much a kind of making the best of a not so good situation, right? I don't think you can fix every PSVR 2 problem and all of a sudden this is the VR headset that is lighting the world on fire. You know what I mean? So that's where I kind of stand on this. I do think it should have happened earlier. No doubt about that. And it's also not the lowest price it's been because it was as low as $349 before. But $400, I think, is still a much easier pill for people to swallow. So, if you've ever been curious about PSVR 2, I still recommend it. I think it's a great headset, which has really good software and now a lot of utility being able to use it on PC, which we still have to address some of the issues where you can't use every feature of PSVR 2's hardware on PC. And we are still waiting on this collaboration between Sony and Apple, where that's how they'll start selling Sense controllers separately, is I think via Apple Store and their retail stores. So it seems like that is still happening. So don't get me wrong, there's still things that need to be fixed and there's work to be done, but it's a step in the right direction. I would have loved to see these things happen sooner, but at least they're happening for what is a marketplace that is not growing, and they're just trying to make the best of what is a poor situation. All right, moving on to Monster Hunter Wilds, a very big high-profile game that came out today that we all know is probably going to sell very well, and that kind of does tie into our discussion on Tuesday, which was the PS5 Pro rate of sale is seemingly not keeping up with PS4 Pro's rate of sale on a launch-aligned basis in the US. And we talked about how PlayStation is in this very safe lane of being unchecked in a way because they've just got such a clear market lead. Xbox is seeing year-over-year declines, and they're also not doing a mid-cycle update. So you've got PS5 Pro positioned very well to be this, de facto console for these high-profile games that come out, where that is the best way to play the console version of these games. And so Monster Hunter is seeing a very similar thing with, say, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, where it's sort of really pushing boundaries. And so the base version is fine, but not exactly great. So we do have an analysis here by Oliver Mackey over on Digital Foundry, where the base PS5's prioritized frame rate mode is very muddy. It's basically another FF7 Rebirth situation. The PS5 Pro version does use PSSR and ray tracing, so the game seems a lot more temporally stable in terms of the image quality, with a more refined look and minimum shimmering, which is also good to see as well. And the frame rate is also mostly a consistent 60 on the Pro, whereas the base console, it's a lot more unstable. There's also an uncapped 120 mode as well with the output, so the game can get into the 70s up to 80, although Oliver doesn't really recommend that version or that setting in particular. But it's looking really good, right? And it's seemingly not the same thing as, like, let's say Dragon's Dogma 2, where like the base version was just like not up to snuff at all. This game is still perfectly playable on the base console, just that, we're getting further and further into the gen where if you want 60 FPS, you're going to take a considerable hit on the resolution to where it's like, well, in my opinion, like it does start to impede on the image quality in a way where I would not really want to play or experience the game like that. For some, it doesn't matter. They will happily take the 60, and I don't fault anybody for that, but it does position the Pro in a very unique circumstance of, like, it's expensive, sure, but like if you're a huge fan of certain games, you might be willing to take that dip and get the low volume console with these big releases. So, it's not like I'm sitting here saying GTA 6 is going to be the version to play, or rather the PS5 Pro is the way to play that game because it will offer 60. It seems like that actually might not happen. Best case scenario, maybe they'll do like a 40 FPS mode or something. I would love to see that. But it still stands to reason that, the publicity is all on Sony's side as far as PS5 Pro and these games coming out, where it's like, yep, big surprise, the console with more on-power GPU compute is going to be able to make this game look the best on console. So Monster Hunter is seeing a very similar Rebirth scenario. Moving on to our next news story, Sony is being sued yet again, another class action lawsuit over PlayStation Store digital game pricing. So this time around, it's being filed in the Netherlands by the Dutch Consumer Foundation, Massa Shade and Consumet. The accusation being that Sony has inflated pricing on the PlayStation Store, and there's no retail competition because digital game vouchers are not sold at third-party retailers anymore. They stopped doing that in 2019. So according to the research, digital games cost on average 47% more than physical versions. The first hearing is expected later this year, and if you remember, Sony has been sued over this before, so we've seen similar lawsuits filed in Portugal and also the UK. That one still moving through the system, and Sony actually did avoid a proposed class action in the US, where this was back in like December, so it was very recent, but what they did was they paid $7.85 million to about 4 million users as a settlement. So they already sort of weaseled their way out of that, but the core issue and why this is different from, say, Xbox or the eShop is that Sony does not allow game vouchers anymore. So there is truly no competition in any scope as far as being able to buy games from that storefront. So because they don't do that, and they only offer PSN cards now at this point at retail, not even PS Plus cards, just straight up currency at retail, that's the issue. And we all know it's true. It's absolutely true. They did give themselves a lot of issues by closing up game vouchers. So it's just something where they're going to be fighting this and trying to come up with settlements like the one that happened in the US. I mean, I think 7.8 million. They got out like a bat as far as accountability goes. And you know where I stand with physical versus digital, which is like, if you're savvy enough, you can absolutely come out way cheaper. It really is egregious sometimes how there are certain games sitting on PSN that are still full price, 60, 70 bucks, and some games are years old at this point, and secondhand copies are, $10, maybe less. I mean, if you're savvy, you can come out way, way under. Which I do also always like to add this qualifier of, it's a little weird nowadays, right? Because if you do prefer to play physical games and buy physical media, certain games, certain publishers, if they go through LRG or something, like oftentimes you're spending more for the game, you're waiting longer for the disc print. And so don't get me wrong, it's very different nowadays, and oftentimes you can't really avoid paying more. But like I said, if you're savvy, if you know how to navigate it, it's a lot cheaper, or it tends to be cheaper still. So yeah, we'll see what happens here. I can't picture any world where Sony doesn't try to settle and avoid massive accountability, but it does seem like Europe tends to be a lot more aggressive in trying to come up with a resolution that really works long term. It has generally been Europe that has made a lot of major movement in the consumer rights area. So hopefully the UK and also now the Netherlands, we see some pressure applied to Sony where there's some genuine third-party options to get these games a little bit cheaper. As far as like a new storefront or maybe the game cards coming back, I don't really know what the resolution does look like, but let's hope it's not something where they're just paying out a settlement and they still get to keep doing what they've been doing. I want to see there be options where you can get the games cheaper. Now, I feel like we have to mention what is clearly the aftermath of Silent Hill 2, which came out on PS5 and PC. This was a partner title for Sony where they bought up timed exclusivity. But it seems like this game did very well, not just critically, but also commercially, which we know the game sold millions at this point. So Bloober team has confirmed that they are indeed working on another Konami IP, which they do directly state was based off the trust that they built off the success of this game, which laid the foundation for signing another agreement. Now, we are hearing that this game is the codename Project G at Bloober, which was already in the concept phase back in 2023. So now it seems like this thing is full steam ahead, or at the very least, they always had the blessing to sort of work on this in a preliminary stage. And there's also other projects internally where there's been some speculation as to if it relates to Silent Hill 1 and 3, like they're doing both of them now at this point, or if it's just, say, Silent Hill 3. Whatever the case is, it seems like, 2 was a big success, and therefore they do have the green light to do more Silent Hill remakes, which, Bloober team did nail it. So it would be great to see them tackle Silent Hill 3 and more so 1 where, any PS1 game, if it's getting remade, it's always cool to see just how much interpretation is then given to that experience, because it looks so much different when you jump that far ahead from those very early blocky polygonal models back on the PS1. But I would also be curious to see if Sony wants to continue partnering as well and buy up exclusivity for these projects. It will be a while until we see that happen, but conceivably they did do it for Silent Hill 2. They thought that game was important enough, and we'll see if that sticks with this these games as well. If anything, it really does beg the question how often they will do this for third-party partner titles, right? Which is, do they feel the pressure to secure these games in the same way that they did the first 1 or 2 years for PS5 compared to Series S and X? You got to think they should feel a little bit more comfortable, but at the same time, the company wouldn't want to get complacent. So it'll be weird going into the back half of PS5 and see what kind of new agreements do get signed, and that kind of will even trickle into PlayStation 6, obviously, at this point. But we'll be watching that for sure. Moving on to some probably PS5 news, the head of Xbox Game Studios, Craig Duncan, recently confirmed over on the official Xbox podcast that Playground Games' upcoming Fable title is delayed to 2026, which over on Reset Era, Nate the Hate, he's known as Nate Drake over there, but he did speculate that Fable might need more time for polish and also getting the PS5 version ready for day one next to Xbox and PC, since apparently the PS5 version was always planned for 2026 anyway. So that would make sense, since we are still in this landscape of games are coming over. We just don't know when or how they're coming over. Will they be day and date? Are certain teams ready to do day and date? Well, in this case, that might provide some context on that delay. Not to say that's the primary reason, but you would think that, okay, if they have a PS5 build that can catch up on time, maybe that would be day one as well. In other secondary Xbox Game Studio news, we also know that Forza Horizon 5 is confirmed for April 29th. Going to be $59.99 USD, so a little bit steep for what is a fairly old game now at this point, but kind of expected when it's launching on a new platform. And then we're also hearing from Tom Warren, writing for The Verge, that Indiana Jones is also targeting an April launch as well. So 2 big titles launching in the same month. So that's what's going on with the current Xbox Game Studios landscape. Next up, I found this one really interesting, and it does have a very unique PlayStation spin we can discuss, but it's the portable PC marketplace and how well these things are selling, which they've always been pretty low volume, but now we know exactly how low volume they are. It is still market research, mind you, because this is coming from The Verge, where the market research firm IDC looked into the portable PC landscape to get an idea of where it is and how well the Steam Deck is doing compared to the other recent devices that came out. So what we learned is that in 2022, which only had the Steam Deck available, 1.6 million units were sold. Now, for 2023, they say 2.8 million handhelds were sold, and over 50% of those were the Steam Deck. So they're not using exact numbers for devices, but they will say that. And then for 2024, 1.4 million were sold, so down again, and 48% of those were the Steam Deck. So they don't break down device install base, but what we can figure out from the way they phrased it is that the Steam Deck is at around 4 million units sold. So there's that, right? What's funny is that I love how Push Square did this story, because they took this and they were like, oh, hey, look, the Steam Deck is like 1/3 of the PS Vita's install base, which it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of true, because it's one of those things where, you know, I think depending on what kind of stuff you read or hear about, other channels you watch or podcasts you listen to, it very much is this idea that like the Steam Deck is such a, I mean, don't get me wrong, like a really good device, but you would almost be led to believe that it's like selling in mass, which is not entirely true. I think people understood that like it was low volume, but to hear these numbers, you think, man, that's really a lot more niche than we thought, which we already acknowledged was a fairly small market. Having said that, yeah, you place it up to like PS Vita, for example, which is considered a total commercial failure, and it's like, yeah, that's not really big at all. Even more so, we have some not direct Sony figures, but you know, when Sony outlined that 3% of PS5 owners since late 2023 have bought a PlayStation Portal, and if you try and extrapolate that to the existing install base, that means they're probably at about 2 million PlayStation Portals right now, and that's a fairly low-priced remote play-only device. It's just one of those things where, like, you have to consider the variables here, which is, and Push Square mentioned this, but it's like the Steam Deck is only available from Valve. From their site, they fulfill it. It's completely in-house. They have no retail presence. And they're also not PlayStation, right? I mean, if Sony were eventually to do their own dedicated handheld, and there's a lot of rumors in that area, you know, they would have a very big retail presence. It's the PlayStation name. People want a local play handheld. It would be very comparable to Nintendo Switch 2 in that case, right? Especially since a lot of studios would be at that point shipping games that are on comparable hardware as far as like performance goes. So there is a lot of upside for Sony to get in this marketplace and conceivably sell a lot more units than what these portable PCs are doing. So it's just one of those like food for thought conversations when you look at how niche that market really is. But at the same time, you know, an established player like Sony could probably move a lot more in that area. Not to say it would be massive. It would maybe still be more of an extension device, considering you would have a PSN you'd log into. It might not be the kind of numbers Nintendo is expected to do for what they have done with Switch or Switch 2, or what Switch 2 will do, rather. But you would safely expect it's going to move a lot more than, say, 4 million units in a 3-year period. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel, a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all, and our Tuesday video was that discussion about PS5 Pro's rate of sale versus PS4 Pro, and also just having a talk 3 months later about, where the console is, personal experience with it so far, things like that, a post-mortem, if you will, 3 months later. And then coming up, as always, we've got probably an upload on Tuesday. We got a Click R3 being filmed on Tuesday, which will probably go live on Wednesday or Thursday, somewhere around there, so we'll be doing that as well. But that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.